For most of my life, I learned what silence sounded like. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't slam doors or raise its voice. It arrived quietly, in the form of unanswered messages, missed birthdays, and the way my mother's eyes slid past me as if I were furniture instead of her daughter. I used to tell myself she was busy, distracted, overwhelmed by life. But after years of watching her show up fully for everyone else, I realized the truth was much simpler and much crueler. She had chosen not to see me. I grew up measuring my worth by how little space I took up. I learned to speak softly, to ask for nothing, to celebrate my accomplishments alone. When I graduated, she didn't come. When I moved cities, she didn't ask where. When I stopped calling, she didn't notice. The absence became so consistent that it almost felt intentional, like a rule she'd written long ago and never bothered to explain to me. By the time I reached my 30s, I had stopped expecting anything from her. Hope, after all, is just another word for disappointment when it comes with conditions. I built my life in quiet rebellion, not to spite her, but because survival demanded it. I worked longer hours than anyone knew. I failed in private. I succeeded in silence. And the less visible my struggle was, the more invisible I became to my family. Christmas, however, has a way of reopening wounds you pretend have healed. Every year, despite everything, there would be an invitation. Polite. Obligatory. A reminder that I was still technically part of the family, even if no one treated me like it. Most years, I declined. That particular Christmas, though, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was closure knocking for the last time. Or maybe it was simply the knowledge that I no longer needed their approval to sit at the table. I arrived carrying nothing but a small gift and a lifetime of restraint. The house was warm, filled with laughter that had never been meant for me. My mother hugged everyone else with both arms. When she reached me, she offered a distracted pat, already looking over my shoulder for someone more important. That familiar ache settled in my chest, but this time, it didn't hurt the way it used to. It felt distant. Observational. Like watching an old movie you've memorized. Dinner unfolded exactly as expected. Conversations flowed around me, not to me. Old jokes resurfaced, stories were retold, and I existed only as background noise. No one asked about my work. No one asked about my life. And my mother, the woman who once taught me how to read, didn't ask me a single question all night. What they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that while they were busy overlooking me, my life had quietly transformed in ways they would never understand. I had crossed thresholds they still believed were out of reach for me. I had become someone they would suddenly care about, not because I had changed, but because numbers have a way of demanding attention. I didn't come to Christmas dinner seeking revenge. I came with clarity. And when the moment arrived, when the table fell into that brief, careless silence, I finally spoke, not to impress, not to punish, but to tell the truth. And that truth would change the way everyone in that room looked at me forever. My earliest memories are not of arguments or chaos, but of quiet displacement. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, swinging my legs while my mother talked over me, around me, past me. I learned early that attention wasn't something you received automatically, it was something you earned, and even then, it could be revoked without explanation. If I brought home a drawing, she nodded. If I brought home an award, she said I could put it somewhere safe. Somewhere invisible. I wasn't abused. That's important to say, because it's the sentence people use to dismiss everything that follows. I was fed, clothed, housed. But I was emotionally rationed. Praise was scarce. Affection was conditional. And questions about my feelings were treated like inconveniences rather than invitations. I learned to process disappointment privately because expressing it made her uncomfortable. At school, teachers described me as independent, mature, self-sufficient. They didn't know those traits were survival tools. I packed my own lunches, signed my own permission slips, and stopped asking for help long before I understood why. When other kids ran to their parents after performances, I waited until the auditorium emptied. It was easier than scanning the crowd for a face that wouldn't be there. The hardest part wasn't the neglect itself, but the inconsistency. Some days, my mother would be warm, involved, almost present. Those days kept me hoping. They taught me to overanalyze her moods, to perform emotional gymnastics for scraps of connection. I thought if I behaved better, achieved more, needed less, she would stay. But she never did. And eventually, I stopped trying to make her. As I grew older, the pattern sharpened. It wasn't that my mother lacked the ability to care, it was that she had chosen where to invest it. Other family members received patience, enthusiasm, and defense. I received tolerance. If I succeeded, it was expected. If I struggled, it was inconvenient. The imbalance was subtle enough to deny, but constant enough to shape me. Family gatherings made it impossible to ignore. She bragged about others' achievements loudly and repeatedly. When someone else spoke, she listened. When I spoke, she interrupted or redirected the conversation. I learned to stop volunteering information, because silence at least spared me the humiliation of being overlooked in real time. What hurt most was how normal it all seemed to her. When I finally tried to address it, gently, carefully, she waved it away. Said I was too sensitive. Said I misremembered things. Said she treated everyone the same. That gaslighting did more damage than the neglect ever could. It taught me not to trust my own perceptions. Eventually, I stopped seeking validation from her entirely. I mourned the mother I wished I had, not the one I did. I built emotional walls not out of bitterness, but necessity. If I didn't expect care, I couldn't be disappointed by its absence. That was the moment our relationship truly ended, not with a fight, but with acceptance. She continued living her life, unaware of the distance she'd created. And I quietly stepped into mine, carrying the weight of her indifference like a familiar ache I'd learned to live with. Leaving home wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no speeches, no promises to stay in touch. I packed my things, hugged people who felt like strangers, and watched my mother check her phone while I said goodbye. That image stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what I already knew. Once I was gone, communication faded quickly. Calls became texts. Texts became silence. Weeks passed. Then months. And when I stopped initiating contact, nothing replaced it. There was no concern, no follow-up, no question about why I'd disappeared. That absence was louder than any argument we could have had. For the first time, I allowed myself to stop explaining her behavior to others. I stopped making excuses. I stopped pretending we were close. And in doing so, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. Distance clarified things. It showed me how much energy I'd spent trying to earn love that was never freely given. Cutting emotional ties wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of preservation. I redirected that energy into my work, my growth, my future. I built a life that didn't depend on approval from someone who had never offered it. By the time years had passed, my mother and I existed in parallel worlds. She knew nothing about my struggles or my ambitions. And I knew, with certainty, that if my life changed dramatically, she wouldn't notice, unless it benefited her. I didn't start my company with confidence or clarity. I started it with stubbornness. By then, I had learned not to wait for permission, encouragement, or belief from anyone else. I saw a problem in my industry that everyone complained about but no one wanted to fix, and I decided I would try. Not because I believed I was extraordinary, but because I was used to being underestimated. Failure didn't scare me anymore. Being invisible did. The early days were brutal. I worked from cramped apartments, borrowed desks, and coffee shops where no one noticed if I stayed too long. I did everything myself: strategy, operations, customer support, sales. There was no safety net. Every mistake cost me sleep, money, or credibility. But each small win felt earned in a way nothing ever had before. I didn't tell my family what I was building. Not out of secrecy, but because I knew what would happen if I did. They would either dismiss it as unrealistic or suddenly become invested for the wrong reasons. Silence protected me. It allowed me to fail without commentary and succeed without interference. Years passed that way. The company grew quietly. Clients came, then investors, then partnerships I never imagined myself negotiating. I learned to speak in boardrooms with the same calm detachment I once used at family dinners. I learned how to listen more than I spoke. How to wait. How to leverage patience as power. There were moments when I wanted to call my mother. Moments when something big happened and instinct kicked in before memory stopped me. Each time, I reminded myself that sharing milestones with someone who never showed up for the struggle would only reopen old wounds. So I celebrated alone. Or not at all. As revenue climbed and responsibilities multiplied, I stayed grounded in the same principle that had guided me since childhood: don't rely on anyone who hasn't proven they'll stay. My team grew. My role shifted. The company became real in a way I couldn't deny. And still, my family knew nothing. That anonymity was freedom. I wasn't the ignored daughter. I wasn't the afterthought. I was a founder, a leader, someone whose decisions mattered. And the quiet pride I felt didn't need witnesses to be valid. Success rarely looks the way people imagine it. For me, it looked like missed holidays, chronic exhaustion, and the constant fear of collapse. Every step forward came with something left behind. Friendships faded. Relationships strained under the weight of my absence. And loneliness became a familiar companion, one I pretended not to mind. There were failures no one ever saw. Deals that fell apart at the last minute. Employees I trusted who betrayed that trust. Nights when I questioned whether the cost was worth it. I learned quickly that resilience isn't loud. It's quiet persistence when quitting would be easier. I didn't have a family cheering me on. I didn't have anyone reminding me I was capable when doubt crept in. I became my own reinforcement, my own reassurance. I kept going not because I was fearless, but because stopping felt like surrendering everything I'd built to the same neglect that shaped me. At times, I wondered if my mother would recognize me now if she saw who I had become. Then I realized it didn't matter. Her recognition was no longer a goal. The life I was creating wasn't meant to impress her. It was meant to sustain me. By the time an acquisition offer appeared, serious, legitimate, life-altering, I was emotionally prepared in a way I hadn't been before. I read every clause carefully. I negotiated without ego. I understood my worth because I had paid for it in years of isolation. When the deal closed, there was no celebration dinner, no family toast, no shared joy. Just a quiet moment alone, sitting with the knowledge that I had changed my life completely, and no one from my past had been part of it. The day the sale finalized didn't feel explosive or surreal. It felt quiet, almost anticlimactic, like reaching the end of a long marathon and realizing the finish line doesn't clap. I signed the last document alone, reread the numbers twice to be sure, and closed my laptop without ceremony. $150 million was now attached to my name, yet nothing around me changed. There were congratulatory emails, formal handshakes, polite acknowledgments from people who understood what the number meant. But there was no one to call. No one who had witnessed the years of uncertainty and doubt. No one who had watched me build something out of emotional absence and stubborn resolve. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. The sale wasn't a peak, it was proof. Proof that my instincts had been right. Proof that the life I built in silence was real and lasting. Proof that I had survived without the validation I once thought I needed. For a moment, I wondered what my mother would say if she knew. Then I imagined her response shifting based on what she stood to gain, and the thought hardened into clarity. This wasn't something I owed her. This wasn't something she deserved to witness. I moved the money into places that felt safe, responsible, distant. I made plans quietly. I continued living modestly. Wealth didn't rewrite who I was, it only removed fear. And in removing fear, it stripped away the last illusion that reconciliation was necessary for closure. The irony wasn't lost on me. The thing that would finally make my family pay attention to me wasn't my perseverance or character. It was a number. And that realization settled heavy in my chest, not as anger, but as acceptance. When the Christmas invitation arrived that year, I stared at it longer than usual. Same wording. Same assumptions. Same expectation that I would show up politely and leave quietly. For reasons I still don't fully understand, I decided to go. I didn't arrive with an agenda. I didn't rehearse a speech. I didn't plan a reveal. I told myself it would just be dinner, just another reminder of why distance existed. But something had changed. I no longer felt small walking into that house. Everything looked the same. Same decorations. Same seating arrangement. Same roles assigned without discussion. My mother greeted me the way she always did, briefly, distracted, already turning toward someone else. And for the first time, I watched it happen without internal commentary. Dinner unfolded predictably. Stories were told. Laughter rose and fell. My presence registered only when necessary. No one asked what I was doing now. No one noticed the quiet confidence that had replaced my old restraint. Halfway through the meal, conversation drifted to work and finances. Complaints about jobs. Jokes about money stress. Casual assumptions about who was doing well and who wasn't. I listened, patient, observant, aware of the irony hanging thick in the air. When my mother finally addressed me directly, it wasn't curiosity that prompted it. It was obligation. She asked what I'd been up to lately, her tone polite but disinterested, already prepared to move on. That was the moment. Not dramatic. Not planned. Just inevitable. I answered honestly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't clear my throat for attention. I simply answered the question the way anyone would if it were ordinary. I said I'd been working. I said the company I started had done well. And then, because silence followed and no one bothered to ask what well meant, I added the rest. I told them I had sold it. The table reacted slowly, like a delayed echo. Someone nodded politely. Someone else smiled without interest. My mother waited, fork midair, expecting the conversation to move on. It didn't. When I mentioned the number, everything stopped. $150 million does that. It freezes rooms. It rearranges faces. It recalibrates respect instantly. Chairs shifted. Someone laughed, assuming I was joking. I wasn't. I repeated it calmly, answering questions I hadn't been asked for years. The disbelief turned into calculation. I watched it happen in real time. My mother's posture changed. Her eyes sharpened, finally focused on me the way they never had before. She asked questions then. Real ones. Where? When? How? Her voice softened. Her interest ignited. That was the moment something inside me closed permanently. Not in anger. In recognition. I saw clearly that the years of silence hadn't been accidental. They had been circumstantial. I had only mattered now because I had become valuable in a way she understood. The rest of dinner blurred. Conversations shifted toward me, but it felt hollow. Compliments arrived too late. Pride surfaced where curiosity had never existed. And I realized I felt nothing about it. No vindication. No triumph. Just clarity. When my mother finally reached for me, physically this time, touching my arm as if we had always been close, I gently stepped back. I told her I was happy. That my life was full. That I hoped she was well. I didn't offer reconciliation. I didn't seek apology. I didn't correct the past. I simply left it where it belonged. At the door, she hugged me tighter than she ever had. And for the first time, I understood that closure doesn't come from being seen. It comes from no longer needing to be. People like to believe stories like this end with forgiveness or confrontation, with tears and emotional speeches that neatly tie everything together. But real life doesn't always offer that kind of symmetry. Sometimes, the ending is quiet. Sometimes, it's simply the absence of expectation. I didn't walk away from that Christmas dinner feeling victorious. I walked away feeling free. Free from the need to prove myself. Free from waiting for acknowledgement that had always come with conditions. Free from rewriting my past to make someone else more comfortable with it. For years, I believed my mother's silence reflected something missing in me. I thought if I achieved more, needed less, or became someone easier to love, things would change. What I eventually learned was that her inability to show up had nothing to do with my worth and everything to do with her limitations. Money didn't heal that relationship. It exposed it. The irony is that the same success she suddenly cared about was built during the years she ignored me. The discipline, resilience, and independence she admired at the end were forged in the absence she created. And once I understood that, I stopped wishing for a different version of her. I didn't cut my family off. I didn't burn bridges. I simply stopped standing at the edge of them, waiting for someone else to cross. I chose to keep my life intact, my boundaries firm, and my expectations realistic. There's a strange peace that comes from accepting people exactly as they are, instead of who you hope they'll become. It doesn't mean approving of their behavior. It means releasing yourself from the burden of trying to change it. If there's anything my story offers, it's this: being overlooked doesn't mean you're insignificant. It means you were in the wrong place, asking the wrong people to see you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to demand recognition, but to build a life so full that recognition becomes irrelevant. I didn't need my mother's approval to succeed. And I don't need her pride to feel complete. My life is mine now, shaped by choice, sustained by effort, and defined by peace rather than permission. And that, more than any number ever could, is the real success story.